Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
Liquidity crisis in the Italian banking sector that was triggered by the collapse of a bank called Banco Ambrosiano. So, Banco Ambrosiano was a bank that essentially laundered money back and forth between itself and the Vatican Bank. It was in an incestuous relationship with the Vatican Bank, and money was being funneled through it, through the money that was being smuggled through the Vatican Bank was then sent to Banco Ambrosiano back and forth. And so eventually somebody got left with the hot potato, and the bank was left with a huge deficit that could not be found anywhere. The money was gone. And in the investigation that followed, a lot of things were uncovered, including a lot of things related to the head of the P2 Lodge, the guy who ran the entire show, Licio Gelli. That he was the guy who ended up bringing the whole thing down when his association with the Banco Ambrosiano led to a police raid of his home, which found a name of over 900 members of the P2 Lodge and also minutes and notes related to the strategy of tension. As I said earlier, on that list that was discovered was the name of later Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, implying very heavily that the people who were in charge then never really gave up power, even though this moment led to Gladio being revealed publicly. So the investigation spread out. A number of people were implicated. Lucio Gelli was eventually, after a lot of back and forth and extraditions, was eventually given a surprisingly light sentence, considering the fact that he was materially tied to this network of right-wing fascist terrorists who had killed many people over the course of the years. One of the other things that happened is that Roberto Calvi, who was the manager of the manager of Banco Ambrosiano, the man who was called God's banker because of his association with the Vatican Bank, was found hanging both from Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982 after he fled the country following the breaking of the Ambrosiano scandal. He had rocks in his pockets. Some people actually think that the way that the rocks were in his pockets were some sort of Masonic message, and who am I to say otherwise? Another person associated with the collapse of the bank and the entire scandal was a man named Michael Sindona, who was a chief member of Propaganda Due, who was associated with all kinds of not only Gladio stuff, but mafia, drug running, and money laundering. He also fled the country. He was arrested and charged in the United States. He was extradited to Italy. He was taken back to the United States. He eventually settled after many fights and attempts to escape and a phony kidnapping that he carried out on himself in order to try to get people to think that he wasn't around anymore. He eventually ended up in Italian prison, where he was promptly poisoned with cyanide in his morning coffee. That is another thing that absolutely happened. You can look this guy up, Michael Sindona, a man who was poisoned in his prison cell with a cyanide-laced coffee. No one was ever charged. No one was ever named as a suspect. They just figured, hey, this guy's got a lot of enemies. This guy who has direct knowledge of all of this shit, literally poisoned in prison. I mean, think about it. At least here with Epstein, they're taking you seriously enough to extend the courtesy of lying to you that he committed suicide, so that you don't have to just have it though so flagrantly in your face that they can do what they want and that there's nothing you can do about it. Here, they're like, yeah, no, fuck it. We'll just poison his coffee. And then we'll say, yeah, someone poisoned him. And then that'll be the end of it. So this investigation snowballed. It led to a huge parliamentary uproar. And eventually in 1990, a massive investigation and series of public hearings in which that culminated in Giulio Andreotti, who was the personification of the Christian Democratic Party after World War II. He was the backbone of the whole thing. He was the party maestro. He was the prime minister any number of times. He would basically be prime minister whenever he wanted to be. He was the heart and soul of the party. Was brought before the parliament and admitted that Gladio was real, that the P2 Lodge was real, that all of this mafia-associated violence, false flag attacks, murders. Let's not forget, this is Italy. Tons of murders of prosecutors and police who were looking into this during this time period. I kind of forgot that. I really should. The whole time this is happening, people are looking into this. Journalists, prosecutors, cops, judges, and they're getting blown up and murdered by the fucking fistful. And he admits most of this to the public in 1990, and it led to a huge crisis. And Italian politics has really never been the same since. Sorry. So that is the last we hear of Gladio in terms of its paper trail of verifiable things. You can talk about things like Gladio 2, which is the theory that the rise of radical Muslim terrorism is essentially a continuation of the strategy of tension that was used in Italy. That everything from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to Al-Qaeda and ISIS are all essentially CIA-sponsored operations. This is another situation where you have a very convincing narrative line, but I'm not necessarily convinced that the evidence is strong enough on the ground to make me take it seriously. Even though the fact of how well radical Islamic terrorism has benefited the post-Cold War American geostrategy is very interesting and something to think about. But like that, I don't want to, like I said, the Kushba stamp of approval. I don't want to put it on everything. But this is all stuff that you have to think about and consider when you're trying to make sense of the world. I mean, there's other strands I could pull on this. I could talk about this shit all day. I mean, if you really want to get nutty, you want to look at Belgian Gladio. You want to look at something called the Brabant killings. These are things that I'm just going to throw out there without any, I'm not even going to dignify them necessarily with a narrative explanation. I'm just going to say, as conspiracy nuts have from time immemorial, do your own research, folks. I'm just saying you can pull on a strand and find it interesting or not. But the Brabant killings, just parenthetically, are nuts. It was a series of spectacularly violent and public and audacious robberies of mostly grocery stores in Belgium in the 80s, where 3 dudes in a van would roll up, firing guns out of the window, murdering people in the fucking parking lot, shooting randomly anyone they encountered for a relatively small amount of money. And tactics and firearms associated with the Belgian special forces that were part of Belgian Gladio operations were connected to the attacks, which, by the way, were never solved. These guys would show up, shoot a bunch of civilians, grab some money, shoot a cop on the way out. No one was ever caught. Very odd. But once again, I don't have anything beyond that. I don't know. I can't know any of this. And I think that's what I want to leave people with. As much as this is amazing to think about, and as much depth as you could give any of this if you chose to look at it, at the end of the day, as long as power is behind a curtain, we're not going to know any of this stuff. And more importantly, our knowledge of it doesn't change our material conditions in any way. I mean, honestly, the real danger with this stuff is if you take it to its maximal endpoint, you end up in a world where you can't change anything, because these people have the power to be anywhere and everywhere at any time and make any outcome happen. And if that's the case, why do anything? Why vote for Bernie Sanders? They're just going to hit him with the heart attack gun. Why do anything? They're just going to stop you. And so that is a real danger. And the way to pull back from that is to just look at your material conditions and remind yourself that they have to work to keep things this shitty. This is not just us being awful. There are people with vested interests in keeping things a certain way. Will describe the intelligence community as the organized crime for the ruling class, and that's 100% accurate. That's why they work hand in glove with organized crime everywhere else that they act, because it's the same model. It's the same criminal model with a specific end of maintaining existing power structures and revenue models. But they have to work at it. They're doing a job because we have the numbers and we have the possibility to organize. And when there's enough of us, we can fucking overthrow this shit. We can take it to them. And because they rule through fear and ignorance, and fear and ignorance are both things that are remedied by solidarity. Because if you're with other people, you're not as scared. And with other people, you're not as ignorant because you have the wisdom of everyone around you. And those are the things that can counteract these people. And that's true whether Jeffrey Epstein killed himself or he was murdered or they switched his body. The only way we're ever going to find out is if we tear down the veil. And the only way we're going to tear down the veil is if we do it together. Because if we all do it at once, they can't stop us. Not with all the MK Ultras and fucking Gladios and Condors in the world. Because there's more of us than them, always. So have fun with it. That's my final comment. Have fun with the conspiracy stuff. Use it to inform your worldview. Like when you know something like Gladio is real, when you know we were doing this shit, it really informs the way you look at things like the collaboration between far right groups and the police now. Like that there's a model for that sort of interaction between extra legal reactionary muscle and the formal military and police powers in a state. And now you can take that model. The role of drugs in lubricating the international intelligence operations, the way that drug money is used and utilized to fund operations that can't be ever have their books examined. That's another thing that you can keep in mind when you look at the politics of heroin and the way that so say for example, the Taliban was on the verge of wiping out opium in Afghanistan before 9/11, and now Afghanistan is the world capital of opium. Well, it is. We're nominally in charge of it. But while you're doing this, just keep your head in the clouds and your feet on the ground, and remember the world